I don't even trust someone to type in their contact information into my phone. We have our lives on our phones, our photos, private photos, credit card statements, PayPal, Venmo. No one touches my phone. Not for any reason. I don't care. And speaking of, computer geeks, what's the worst thing you've found on someone's computer? Story 1. It's completely true that smoker PCs can be pretty darn disgusting and usually die from passive smoking long before any humans would. But those are not the worst kind I've ever attempted to resurrect. Back in around 2007-2008, while working in an IT service company, I was called out to one of our business clients. Their old IBM workstation from before Lenovo had taken over, located out in their production hall, had crashed and now wouldn't even turn on, let alone boot up. So I drove out there, got it disconnected, and opened it up, only to discover, and I kid you not, what I reckon to be about an inch of soot and slag embedded with what is best described as tiny razor-sharp iron fillings and fine pellets all over the motherboard, the hard drive, and simply covering every nook and cranny on the inside. Obviously, also completely clogging up the power supply and the fans. Very, very, very extremely nasty, and quite the miracle that it hadn't broken down any sooner. Points to IBM for making a computer which can endure that level of absolute hardcore torture for as long as it did. Oh, did I mention that this customer of ours just happened to be the local over 200-year-old iron foundry? Maybe I should have started with that. It must have slipped my mind. Anyway, the sole production workstation dedicated to controlling the furnaces at the local foundry. Let's just say that even before I got into the van, I knew that this was going to be quite interesting and rather demanding. I also knew that I absolutely had to come up with a solution as fast as possible, because they were obviously losing money every second their production was completely halted, like this. One of the workers took this poor thing into the center of the production hall, where the ceiling was highest, and turned their heavy-duty air ventilation/filtering system up to max, and with everyone out of the way, and himself wearing protective gear, razor-sharp iron fillings and fine pellets, remember? He went up to the computer and gave it a few short bursts with the production hall's air compressor. A black, obsidian-colored mushroom cloud stood up out of the cabinet. It looked almost as if he had dropped a tiny nuke into it instead. Luckily, within 10 to 15 minutes, their heavy-duty ventilation system had made short process of this ominous dark cloud of ultimate doom. Whatever damage this may have done to it, I didn't really care, because I was pretty sure that this ex-parrot wasn't going to be pining for the fjords anymore, even before the worker dropped his tiny air bomb into it. Since such iron fillings usually have this tendency to be rather conductive, providing plenty of nearly guaranteed short circuits. But more importantly, this was the fastest way for me to get to the hard drive, which didn't involve me digging it out while wearing boxing gloves to prevent myself from tearing my hands and fingers to shreds. Time was of the essence here, since this was the kind of furnaces you need to keep running 24/7. The longer they were left to cool down, the longer it would take to get them back up to temperature again, especially with a batch of slowly solidifying iron inside them. And the system wouldn't allow them to run without their monitoring brain for safety reasons, I assumed. I knew that this workstation had originally been part of a batch of 5 identical computers at purchase, and that the other 4 had ended up in the office building. I also knew that the office people would gladly donate one to get production up again. So I got the hard drive out of the air-nuked computer. I didn't even bother, or rather risk, to see if it would spin up. Got the drive out of the office computer, and they were exactly the same brand and model, just as I had hoped for. Removed the shredded-looking and highly likely fried controller off the air nuke drive, and temporarily replaced it with the donor controller. And to my relief, The drive seemed to be working just fine. So I went and grabbed a fresh new drive out of my van and cloned the AirNuke drive onto the fresh one. Popped the fresh drive into the office computer and started another image file backup of the AirNuked one just in case, before returning to the production. From getting the AirNuke drive out to presenting the furnaces with their new and fully working brain took me about 30 to 45 minutes with cloning and everything. With the backup image file done, I put the controllers back in order. No reason to let a perfectly good drive go to waste. I think all in all, their production had only been down for 2.5 to 3 hours. That would be from the crash, so before we got the call to the furnaces were back at production temperature again. Truth be told, I had kind of expected it to happen sooner rather than later, and had sort of semi-prepared a contingency plan in my head. About a week later, my boss and I had another meeting with their management. Mainly us, yet again, having to preach about backups, redundancy, and building a small room to shield their furnace brain from its otherwise rather harsh production environment. Somehow, I had a feeling that they would probably be more susceptible to our suggestions this time around. So, just to sum it up, what is the worst thing I found on someone's computer? Does soot, slag, tiny razor-sharp iron fillings, and fine pellets count? Not what I was expecting for the first story here. I guess that counts as what you find on the computer, and it's probably about as filthy as you're gonna get in any of these other stories. Ha 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 ha, fact dad joke. Anyway, moving on. Story 2. The toolbars are the second worst thing I've found on a computer, and it wasn't one I was fixing. It was one my friend was actually using. She had a netbook, and the internet browser had less than 10 lines of text visible within Internet Explorer. That's how it's aged, Internet Explorer. The worst thing I found was someone's resume and info with their SIN number on a computer I picked up from the side of the road. Something everyone needs to be educated on is cleaning your information off a computer before you get rid of it. I was recently given a tablet that was sitting around another family member was throwing away because it didn't work. So I removed the battery, ran power through the connector, and when it came on, it had no password and my grandmother's email signed in. I factory reset the tablet, and it's now back together in its non-working state until I decide between buying a battery for it or adding a different power supply since it's going to be 8 years old this year. I don't want to spend a lot of money on it. The best thing I found on a computer, not one I was repairing, but one I got, however, was a directory in My Pictures containing a bunch of pictures of puppies and tons of games that didn't require an installer. So I just copied them and still have them to this day. The computer was a 2002 Dell Dimension I had picked up off the side of the road in around 2015 and used it until an IDE to SATA adapter awful shop sold me shorted out the motherboard. Some of the things you could find on a computer made me worried about what was on a couple SAS drives I had that came out of a server I picked up off the side of the road and kept them until I decided to whip them on the ground outside until the platters shattered, then threw them away. I hoped to hook them up someday and see if I could find anything good on them, but wasn't going to spend the money for two 250 gig drives I didn't know the working status on that I was going to end up not using, so I destroyed them. That's very true. If you're going to get rid of a computer, if you're selling it or you're just going to throw it away, learn how to completely wipe your information off of it. It's not that hard. I think the most it's going to cost you is a bit of time for the process to take place, whether it's just completely writing over the information several times, factory resetting, just make sure nothing sensitive is on there. Story 3. Slightly different. The worst thing someone wanted put on their computer. During my time as a Navy IT, I was assigned to an F-18 squadron. One day, one of the pilots came to me and said he wanted the entire maintenance database installed on his laptop. This was bad for two reasons. First, the database was on the network, so any changes or updates would be seen by everyone. Installing the database on his laptop would prevent those updates and make the information useless within the first day. Second, and more importantly, the database was over 40 gigs in size, and his laptop hard drive had less than 8 gigs of available space. I tried to explain this to him. He didn't get it. He just played the pay grade game and insisted that since he was an officer and I was an enlisted, he was entitled to what he wanted, and it was my obligation to give it to him. I took a trash bag out to the wastebasket next to the desk and had him follow me downstairs to the hangar floor next to one of the jets. Opening the bag, I handed it to him and pointed to it. This represents the space on your hard drive. I then pointed to the jet. That represents the size of the database you want me to put on your hard drive. Now, you figure out how to put that, the jet, into this, the bag, without breaking either one. He still couldn't figure it out. Later, I got called into my department head's office. He started ripping me a new orifice about how dare I refuse an order from an officer. He wasn't prepared for my response. Because he was a total idiot. That stopped him in his tracks long enough to explain to him what had happened and what I'd done. After a few moments of silence, he nodded slightly and said, "You're right. He is a total idiot." I'm all for trying to explain technology to someone as clearly as possible. If it takes using object lessons, so be it. But sometimes people just don't get it. I've had to explain some things to my mom when I've had to help her out with her laptop. Sometimes she gets something, sometimes she doesn't. I just take it as a challenge to try and come up with a better example that will help her figure out or understand what's going to happen. Story 4. I had my own business years ago for the mobile home park and surrounding area, as well as put together workable stations for a thrift shop that made money for a blind school. I would teach computer stuff for paying customers, and I would also take on repair work. Some customers wanted to learn the whole thing, how to build and repair themselves, and others just wanted to learn simple things like how to use the webcam and mic to record for college classes. I've come across all kinds of things like from this video. Only once, one time, the excuse, "it just turned off," was actually valid. A power cable had come loose and needed reconnecting. The amount of corn and hijacking malware was ridiculous, especially from the computer of the manager. I'd finished clearing all the malware from the system and removed all the leads that could go back to the site that they got it from. The very next day, it was like I had never touched the computer. I had a talk with them about where the stuff was coming from. Then they banned their son from the computer. I didn't have to touch it after that. Story 5. The year was 2013, and I worked help desk for a potato chip factory. One day, the head of HR from our site came in and asked if I would be willing to stop by her house after work and look at her personal computer. She was a nice lady, and I had nothing going on, so I said, "Sure, I'll take a look." I took a look at it, and there is a ton of dust inside the case. Blow it out and turn it on to check the OS for issues. I run a scan, and it finds some malware. I get it cleaned up and am about to leave when she asks me to help her back up her files. I go to back everything up and find a folder with over 300 gigabytes of pictures. She insists that's the folder she wants backed up and doesn't care about anything else. I copy everything to a USB flash drive, and when I go to verify everything is there, I see the pictures in question were clown corn. In her off time, she and her husband dressed up as clowns and had fun while taking pictures. It was only slightly disturbing. Story 6. Had a guy bring in a computer because it would not run because of a virus. I had one of my guys run the typical tests. System was acting a bit odd. Seemed like a virus or possible bad startup program. My tech decided to check out the files and found a ton of child corn. A lot. I worked for the big computer company of the day, whose name sounds like the word hell. The guy that brought it in was an employee at the same company that we were. We had off-duty state police work security. They looked at the child corn and then had the guy arrested later. He dropped it off to get fixed. It was beyond disturbing. Also had a very attractive gal drop off her system for the same kind of virus issue. Turns out she and her husband/boyfriend had made videos of them having fun. Found the virus, got it fixed, and she picked it up. It was hard to look at her with a straight face at that time. Why do you drop a computer with private information off to a repair shop? You don't know where that person has to look to fix your computer. Granted, there are bad actors, but I don't think the people in this story were actively looking for this kind of thing. I don't think this is the kind of stuff they actively seek out, especially from the first person. They don't need that hassle. They're just trying to fix computers.
Please like and subscribe if you made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day.
Story 7. I've heard horror stories, but I've been lucky. Never found anything worse than nude pictures, but for the most part, I mind my own business. I will never go into another person's pictures or videos, history, and all that unless it's absolutely required to fix or back up the information. I know some people would argue, but I don't know what I'd do if I found something really bad. I believe strongly that when a person brings a computer to you, that it's in confidence, as it is their personal information. People have medical data on their computers/devices, nude pictures, and all sorts of other private information. I would never want to break that trust. I think of it kind of like a doctor. If there's no immediate risk to someone, then it's not my business or anyone else's. Not including a risk to the owner of the computer, as he or she has the right to do whatever he or she feels is necessary for his or her own health, body, and life. Story 8. Back in the time I was servicing TV sets and radios, I found some unusual things inside of a TV set cabinet or radio cabinet. A number of times I found a dead mouse. I also found spiders and flies inside of TV sets and radios. Sometimes the critter or insect would get in contact with the circuit board or some wiring, cause a short, and be electrocuted. When this happens very often, components get damaged. When I was doing computer support, I found some interesting things inside the computer case or the keyboard. Very often, I found bits of food under the keyboard keys. I also found spilled liquid. There were times the keyboard was damaged and had to be repaired. One time, I found a small dead grass snake inside a computer case. Many of the computers had issues from not having proper shutdown, boot drive too full, liquid or food damage, malware installed, and so on. Story 9. I gave up trying to install a second drive onto my old PowerMac 8500. The internal framing was a pain in the butt to deal with, so I took it to a shop to do the install. They always used cans of pressurized air to blow out any case they opened as an extra, but the very first puff of air on my computer created such an enormous cloud of dust that the tech stopped working, went into the back, and then came back with a small vacuum and vacuumed the interior of the thing. Turns out keeping one's desktop computer under the desk in a back corner of a room you don't vacuum or clean in as often as you should is a bad thing. Amazingly, I used that 8500 for at least another year before upgrading to a newer system, and it's still in a box somewhere in my basement. Using compressed air to blow out the computer is actually a really good thing to do on a regular basis. It's kind of like vacuuming on a regular basis. There are compressed air cans, those are cheap, but there are also rechargeable air blowers. You can usually find them on the online sites. I really recommend looking those up. Those are pretty cool. You can find some very powerful ones. Story 10. I worked in the IT department for a medium-sized business in the early 2000s. The company was upgrading the old PCs and laptops for newer ones when the computers would start to have some sort of issue to be basically parted out and recycled. The process was simple. Turn it on, format, and then break it down to the main components for recycling. We had several computers to do a week, and it was kind of a mindless task. I grabbed a laptop that was easily mid-90s machinery. I turned it on, formatted it, and was about to break it down when I noticed that there was only one screw in the bottom, but everything was pretty firm. Nothing seemed loose. Turns out the employee had superglued the laptop together. A drill and a few bad words later, and we ended up just throwing the whole laptop in the dumpster. Story 11. In my repair shop, it was the policy to never look at anything personal on the computer. We even had tools that made us able to repair certain things that normally would demand us to look at the content. In 99.99% of the time, we had absolutely no idea what the computer had been used for or what it contained. In the rest, we had asked for specific permission to open a folder, the email program, and so on. In these few situations was it only one person, and the person was obligated to never speak of what he saw. Anyone who gained access or spoke about content to anybody got fired on the spot. We had much to do with government stuff, huge firms with trade secrets, but also the rare normal customer. All was protected in the same way. Story 12. I'm not a person that works in computer repair. I am somebody, though, that sometimes gets asked to fix one. The last time was in the summer of 2022, and my girlfriend asked me to look at her laptop. It was really running slow. I installed SpeedFan and took note of how hot the processor was running. I spent that afternoon taking it apart. Don't do this unless you have experience working on laptops. I cleaned the fan after removing the fan and heat sinks. There also was not much thermal paste, so I reapplied some. I put it back together and ran Malwarebytes and removed about 50 things that were also slowing the system down. That evening, I handed the laptop back to her. Heat issues are the common thing I find when I'm asked to look at a system. I work off a laptop, and I actually have sort of a desk that you set it on that has additional fans to blow it out. I've never really had any heat issues with this thing. And of course, I blow it out. With air. Don't give me that look. Story 13. I work for a small computer repair shop, and one time a person brought in a desktop computer he had sitting in his garage for years and wanted us to fix it because it wouldn't boot. I opened up the case and nearly pooped my pants when I seen the entire inside was covered deep in spiderwebs, thick like cotton candy, and about 100 spiders crawling around. I quickly grabbed the open computer and ran for the door and dumped it out in the parking lot. I got my phone and took some pics for posterity, and then called the owner to pick up his computer, telling him we refuse to fix it, and described the contents. He never did come pick it up, so I placed it out by the dumpsters. Story 14. I worked as a computer tech, repairing desktops, laptops, workstations, printers, etc. at multiple Best Buy stores and 2 CompUSA locations in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I've seen everything you can imagine on people's machines, from child corn to bestiality to scat and vomit corn. I've also seen roach-infested, cat pee-covered machines, dead mice, and even paper clips covered in what looked like earwax in a printer. You name it, I've probably seen it. Working in IT, I've continued to see a lot of gross stuff, kitty corn, beast corn, etc., but I've stopped seeing dead mice and that sort of thing. I've also seen plenty of spilled coffee, soda, pancake syrup, etc. in laptops, plus the usual malware and all that. Story 15. Had a family friend who maxed out our monthly internet in a couple of days downloading free games. Eventually, karma reared its ugly head when she complained her computer was running too slow. We found some obscure antivirus software we'd never heard of before. We asked her about it, and she said she saw it in an advertisement online that it would speed up her computer. Even the web browser was infected. There were many arguments. Eventually, we got a trusted antivirus installed. Turns out the laptop had more viruses than PC games. To this day, she's still just as gullible, but she learned not to download advertised antivirus software that will speed up her computer or free up disk space. Story 16. The worst thing I ever found on someone's computer was this lady's desktop computer. She had 4 megs of RAM with Windows 5. She got a CD of 10,000 fonts and she loaded all 10,000 fonts into memory. This caused her hard drive to crash constantly. Add to that, she animated every icon with IconDult, so 25% of her processor time was dedicated to icon animations. She absolutely insisted on keeping both the 10,000 fonts in memory and the animated icons. Aside from a defrag, there was nothing I could do for her. I simply recommended she buy a supercomputer with 16 times the RAM. Story 17. My friend fixes computers for a living. The worst one he ever fixed was from this guy who complained that his PC overheated really quickly every time he turned it on. When my friend opened the PC, it was completely crammed from head to toe with dust. The man was a carpenter, and the PC was in the same area as his workshop. My friend was amazed that he didn't burn down his workshop. When the man came back, my friend had a stern talk with him and returned a large trash bag of sawdust to him. Story 18. I used to work for the IT department for a small college. A student came in needing some help with their computer. We turned it around to get at the screws that held it together, and there found a stamp saying property of a different college. We called them up and gave them the serial number, and sure enough, it had been stolen from them. Apparently, the boyfriend of our student had gotten it for her, and she either never noticed or didn't understand the significance of the stamp.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.